Hi, my name's Peter Grutenbauer and I've decided to prepare a series of videos about action research. Action research is something I'm really passionate about and I've been involved in for a long time. It started when I was working with a colleague of mine called Stephen Kemmis, who's one of the world leaders in this field. These videos aren't meant to be some professionally produced or super high quality videos that you might buy or see in a book or something like that. They're really just informal chats about parts of action research. So I hope you enjoy them and you find them a bit useful. This is the first one where we're just really introducing action research. This is the series of 12 videos that we're going to make, and as you can see, this is the first one, and this gives you some idea of what's to follow. We may make some more later on, but they're just designed as a series of informal chats about aspects of action research and what we think it looks like and what it might be done, how it might be done. So one of the things about action research is it's a really broad church of different ideas about how to do research. And it has looked in various forms around different parts of the world and in different countries and in different disciplines. My background's education, and that's the area I'm going to talk about, but it's certainly been used in many other subject and discipline areas as well. The reason I've chosen to use action research is an opportunity to re-emphasise what I would call educational research. And this stems from my work with Stephen Kemmis and Ian Hardy, Christine Edwards-Groves, Jane Wilkinson and Lorette Bristol when I was based in Charles Sturt University. But what it is educational research is something that places the interests of students and teachers and societies at the centre of the research process. Often I would say it's a way of putting the classroom back in the centre of research, the hot site of where education happens. And at the bottom there you can see there's a quote from Aristotle from his tome The Ethics. He says, "We are conducting an examination not so we know what virtue is, but that we may live a good life." And the idea is there that when you're doing action research, it's not about finding the final theory or action of it or answer to something. It's a way of doing the job that you're doing better or differently in the site where you are, improving the practices that you're looking at. So in terms of education, that usually means teaching and learning. So from our perspective, there are 4 features of action research. The first one, it's about actions. It's about the practices of education. So we're looking at what's actually done in education, not just theories or ideas about how it should be done or could be done or what might be done or what we think's being done. It's what is actually happening. And so that's why it leads to the second point. It's based on evidence. In action research, we collect evidence or data. We usually use the word evidence more than data simply because it gives that idea of a historian collecting ideas about what's going on rather than just pure numbers. But by collecting evidence about what's actually happening in sites, we can actually then work at improving what we know is actually going on, not just what we think's going on. The third thing is it's about development and change. This is not some sort of neutral research where you do a study and report it and the researcher is neutral and very objective, even if that's at all possible. This is about changing something. It's an intention of developing and growing something. And that development and growth is based on the evidence that's collected. The fourth thing is that it's collaborative. It requires people to work together. It's hard to imagine doing action research on your own. And if you think in an educational context, it has to involve all the people that you're working with. And that includes obviously other teachers and school leaders and principals, but also students. They seem to be pretty important in the schooling process, and their parents and their communities. So it requires people to work together. So the first part there I've written down is action. And you'll see there I've deliberately used the word the practices of education. And this is where the point is, it's what's actually going on in the classroom or educational site. And so the three main ones are learning, which is the prime purpose of schooling. The only reason we have schooling is because students are learning things. Teaching, which is the main way we have input into student learning, and leading practices which relate to the leadership of schools. But I'm not just talking about the principal here, I'm talking about middle leaders and teachers as curriculum leaders, and it could involve students as leaders in the classroom as well. You'll also notice that we've used the word practices rather than just action. By practices, we're talking about the sayings and doings and relatings that people do in trying to address some sort of project. In other words, in a classroom, a practice of teaching might involve certain languages and ways of thinking about teaching, certain things you do. So the teacher might stand at the front and give a lecture, or they might work collaboratively with students. And it involves relating to the children in certain ways. You relate to the kids in your class in a certain way, but other ways are not obviously appropriate. Now, having said that, when we're doing action research, it's good to focus on the practices, but it's not the practices alone that make a difference. It's the conditions that shape it. So if you're thinking again about learning in a classroom, teaching happens, which helps shape that learning. And also this is in turn shaped by things like curriculum documents and resources provided by the government, assessment regimes and things like that. So it's not enough just to understand and develop the practices, you've also got to understand and develop the conditions and arrangements that shape those practices. And the third point here, when we talk about practice, often people say, oh, we were trying to find out what best practice is. But in action research, we'd argue that there is no best practice. There's not some formula or recipe that applies across a range of sites and contexts. In each case, these educational practices are site specific, and we have to find out what's going on here in this site and in this place, and for you that would be in your school or in your learning centre. It doesn't mean what you find out is relevant or would apply to people in other sites. So action research is something that is done on the actual practices that are undertaken in particular places. We're not looking for the answer for education everywhere. And indeed, if there was an answer to that, we probably would have known it by now. And the main thing that we do know is that we don't know that there's an answer. So it means that there probably isn't an answer, and we have to find it in each case. And that's why action research is useful. The second thing I put here is it's evidence-based. And what, again, this refers to is the same as the last point. It refers to what's actually going on in classrooms. It's about systematic inquiry about what is occurring, what practices are being undertaken, what things are shaping those practices in real sites. Now, I remember as a school teacher, I thought there was all sorts of things happening in my classroom that were really important and were quite clear. But when I found out some of the feedback I got through the evidence I collected, it wasn't always what I thought was going on. And you just have to sit in the back of someone's class or in a lecture room or something, and you'll get a different perspective on what's going on. So the purpose of the evidence is to find out what's actually happening, what the children or the learners are actually doing, what they're actually learning as they engage in the activities and the tasks that you might set them as a teacher. We talk about evidence rather than data, and I mentioned this before. It's just that idea of a historian gathering clues and ideas and evidence about what's going on. When I say data, often people think of just numbers and statistics, and that certainly can be a part of it, but it's more than that. The third feature we mentioned about action research is about development and change. So unlike lots of other sorts of research that you might have heard of, where they're just trying to find out in an objective way what's going on, action research is not about that at all. It's about deliberately focusing on change. The point of action research is to change and develop something. And as you've engaged in a few rounds of action research, at the end of it, you should be different than you were at the start. If nothing's changed, then probably you haven't done action research. It needs to therefore also be responsive to the needs of the community and the learners in that community. It's like starting from the classroom out. Now, if you know about a lot of educational development, at least in Australia, it's often triggered and forced on us by government policy or changes that occur outside the school site, and they then came to deliver on top of us. But what we know is a lot of those don't particularly work very well, and they take a long time to get any traction. What we're saying here is that if you want to develop education, you really need to start from the classroom and work out. So who are the students and the learners in that site, and what are they trying to learn? What are the things around that particular class or school site that shape it, and how can we develop it from there? These things we'll talk about in more detail later. The last point I made was about working collegially. Action research, I think, is built on, but also has a great benefit of enabling colleagues and professionals to work together on shared investigation, trying to nut things out and examine and develop things together. And this gives a sense of collegial and collective responsibility for the learning of the students in the school site, and a sense of camaraderie and solidarity together as you try and address these things. So it's not really a solo activity, and some of the questions we'll ask, and we'll talk about this further later, is when you're thinking about developing something or starting some action research in a school site, who's involved? Who's affected? And therefore who should be included? Now, it doesn't mean everyone's included in the same way. They might have different roles and different parts in it, but it's certainly not just usually one person. And if you're a teacher, if nothing else, you're working with students and they have some interest, I'm sure, in what's going on. So this is just a broad introduction to action research. If you want to find out more about collaborating with Griffith University on action research, then you can contact the PL Hub, and the website's there. We've done a lot of projects with schools around school-based development, around action research. So thank you for watching. The next video will be on forms of action research. The contact details for me are at the bottom there if they're of interest to you.